Hi, this is Brian too. It's the Thursday, the 5th of July, 2018. I want to give an example of organized stalking, how it works with mind control technologies, and how it's utilized by law enforcement, by the federal government, hiding behind and using law enforcement against activists, dissidents, and whistleblowers, victims of their technology. Give an example, explain a couple of basic things, and then go into detail. First of all, what happened today was, they must constantly get in the victim space and provoke the victim at regular intervals in order to keep the target, the mind control victim, sensitized to the organized stalking. The victim must become sensitized. They need to tie the victim. They need to tie the victim to that particular stimuli, whether it be trigger objects, trigger words, trigger colors, trigger emblems, trigger situations, trigger conversations, etc. They want to tie the victim, sensitize the victim to the organized stalking. So it must be done at regular intervals, and it must be aggressive. So organized stalking is based on two things. It's based on one thing and comprised of two things. I'm going to go over the basics, and then I'm going to go over what happened to me today, in an attempt to try to help people who are targeted. It's based on the choice reference patterns of the victim, of the mind control victim, of the target. All targeted individuals. All mind control victims are targeted individuals, but not all targeted individuals are mind control victims. Okay, doesn't matter. All targeted individuals fall into one of four categories. And the reason people become targeted or will be targeted is because they fell into one of those four categories. So look for constant interference with this video. That's provocations designed to constantly provoke me. Okay. If it happens, it's happened before. They target the communications, the financial transactions, the health and well-being, the daily activities, etc., daily life of the victim, to force the victim into a constant series of never-ending responses. Because trauma-based mind control is based upon the responses of the victim. It's happened for years. They go after all my electronic equipment is hijacked, remotely hijacked, because it has to be. They can't allow any type of external interference, which the RNA supercomputer, which the victim is remotely tied to, cannot measure. Any variables which cannot be measured, they must stop or minimize. Okay, so all targeted individuals fall into one of four categories. Judicial targets, extrajudicial targets, targets of opportunity, and what are called lucrative targets. People say, why me? How was I targeted? You were targeted because you fell into one of those four categories. Judicial targets are basically people who are targeted because they committed a crime or they're suspected of committing a crime. Extrajudicial targets are those who they suspect may have committed a crime, but they can't prove it, and may range all the way to the other end of the spectrum with whistleblowers, activists, and dissidents, like a whistleblower. Okay, those are extrajudicial targets. The third category is called lucrative targets, and that's people who, for example, may possess sensitive information or hold sensitive positions, etc. They are lucrative targets. And then the fourth category of all targeted individuals are called targets of opportunity, which is a very broad area, and just about anyone can fall into that area. People, for example, who are randomly targeted for the purposes of training, research, and development and mind control technologies would become targets of opportunity. So those are the four categories of all targeted individuals, whether they're mind control victims or whether they're not. Okay, doesn't matter. They're targeted individuals because they fell into one of those four categories: judicial targets, extrajudicial targets, lucrative targets, and targets of opportunity. I'm an extrajudicial target, having recorded the FBI committing multiple felonies and for other reasons, trying to expose the crimes, etc. I became an extrajudicial target. But my targeting has been going on for over 21 years. I don't know when exactly it started, but 21 years ago it was well underway in the Cayman Islands after I got back from Nicaragua. Directed energy attacks, organized stalking, voice of God weapons, etc. All that began, was well underway back in 1997. Now, it could go all the way back to childhood. I don't know. If I did the math, I connect the dots. It does go back to childhood. But I can say for an absolute fact it was well underway in 1997. I became a targeted individual at that point that I know of. When it actually started, I don't know. Okay? So those are the four categories of all targeted individuals. Today, they must force the victim to respond. Trauma-based mind control is based on the responses of the victim. Each response is an electromagnetic emission pattern in the victim's brain, a synaptic response, which can be remotely measured, identified, developed, and integrated back into RNM data. That's how mind control works. Basically, they tie the victim, remotely tie the victim for life by way of a bidirectional stream of energy to a supercomputer, and then using the brainwave signature, the digital brainwave imprint of that victim, which they were able to remotely measure. They upload that back to that supercomputer, and they basically tie the victim for life to that computer, which then images, measures, transmits all electromagnetic, monitors all electromagnetic activity of the victim's brain until the victim's untimely death. That's how remote neural monitoring works, the different stages: formulation, predictive, integration, etc. That's all part of remote neural monitoring. So basically, what happened today, I'll just run over what happened, and then I'll explain organized stalking, a couple of simple things, and I'll go into detail. Today I was in a convenience food store, and the organized stalker came in, got it close to me as possible, and then I was standing at the counter trying to pay for my coffee, and he took a pack of cigarettes or whatever he had in his hand. I was trying to ignore him, he wouldn't let me, and he threw it as after the cashier had walked away, stepped away from the cash register. He threw it, his item, right in front of me, with my stuff. Okay, and then the cashier walks back up. Well, I have two choices. I can either push his item back out of the way. I must respond if I do that, or I can ignore him and pay for his cigarettes, okay, and my coffee. You see, it's called the non-cooperative gaming theorem, okay, otherwise known as the hyper game theory. At the point that I had to push his stuff away from mine, okay, where I had my stuff, there was a very small area, counter. Only one person could stand there and pay for their things at a time. It was at the 7-Eleven. At that point, I was forced to respond. The victim is forced to respond in order to function and survive. If they can't do it situationally or conversationally, they'll do it physically, okay, which is what happened. I pushed his stuff out of the way, then he started getting irate and yelling and screaming, got into my face this close, threatening me and aggressive behavior, tapping me on the arm. That's assault and battery. Placing a person in the immediate fear of their physical safety is assault. Battery is the slightest touch and anger. I then recorded that incident as I called 911, and then I recorded the San Diego Police's response to that incident. But the point is, I was forced to play the game. They will not allow you to defeat their technology. They will not allow you to ignore them. There are only two ways to defeat the hypergame theory. They're using the hypergame theory on their targets, on their victims, the non-cooperative gaming theorem. It's either refuse to play the game to begin with, ignore them, or place the opposing party in a position where they can no longer better their position against you. That's called the Nash Equilibrium, okay? Well, you can't. The government has too many resources, and you're dealing with a supercomputer that can think 5,000 times faster than you can. Exa-Scale systems can actually think 1 billion times faster than a person can, okay? So you're dealing with a series of supercomputers plus an unlimited resources of the government, manpower, money, etc. And it's just impossible to place them into a position where they can no longer better their position against you. And over 21 years, I've done it one time, okay? So the only option is to refuse to play the game to begin with, to ignore them. Well, they're not going to allow that, okay? Just like today, he took his item, he threw it in front of me where I was purchasing my things. I was forced to respond. In order to function, I was forced to push the stuff out of the way, so I wasn't charged for it. Very small little area there, okay? In other words, I was forced to respond. So call the police. Police, it's all a game. San Diego Police. Organized stalking is a paradigm controlled at the local level in every local jurisdiction in America by local police departments using third-party community-based agents called swarmers, okay, which are responsible for each neighborhood, each region, etc., which they live, work, and play in. Because they live, work, and play in those areas and can justify their presence for being there, it leads to and allows for greater degrees of indirection and plausible deniability. So when the victim calls and says, I'm being stalked, the stalker says, oh, no, that's not how it happened at all. We live, work, and play here. That guy started it. So the victim is discredited. That's how they set up and trap the victim as well. I've used it on me several times. So organized stalking, what is it? It's a paradigm used to discredit, to set up and entrap, etc., targeted individuals. People who fell into one of those four categories: targets of judicial targets, extrajudicial targets, such as whistleblowers, activist dissidents, whistleblowers, those are extrajudicial targets. The third category being lucrative targets, and the fourth category being targets of opportunity. It's used to discredit and set up and entrap them, etc. It's used basically to neutralize. The key word is to understand is to neutralize those people, activist dissidents and whistleblowers. In my case, anyway. Again, judicial targets, extrajudicial targets, lucrative targets, targets of opportunity. And so what they do basically is they force the victim constantly to respond. It's not enough that the victim responds to just any situation that's already interference going on right now. It's not enough that the victim respond to any situation, any conversation, any random or chaotic event. The victim must respond to their specific stimuli, or the verification process breaks apart and mind control fails. Without verification, there can be no mind control. It cannot happen. It is absolutely impossible. They have to verify the responses of the victim. In order to achieve that, they use organized stalking. For surveillance, to keep the mind control victim from defeating the technology through spontaneity, etc. To provoke the victim constantly into emotional responses which can be remotely measured and integrated back into R&M data for the purposes of verification, to discredit the victim, etc., etc. They use it for a lot of different things. But organized stalking is important to understand. It's comprised of one thing: the choice reference patterns of the victim. In order to understand organized stalking, the person has to go back and look at a pattern of their previous choices, favorite restaurants, modes of transportation, etc., where they live, work, and play. That's called choice reference patterns. What are choice reference patterns? Memories. Okay, that's what mind control is about: interfering with the memory and thought process of the victim, mapping out the memory and thought process of the victim, and organized stalking is used to achieve that. Once you understand that organized stalking is based on choice reference patterns, you have to understand what it's comprised of. And it's essentially two things: situational scenarios and conversational scenarios, called street theater. And those situational and conversational scenarios will always be based on events or topics they know will capture the attention of the victim. That's called the hypergame theory. Once the organized stalking begins, the situational and conversational scenario begins, they need to keep developing it. It's not enough the victim respond one time. They need to keep forcing the victim into a series of never-ending responses. So one organized stalking situational and conversational scenario will lead to multiple scenarios within the same time frame, within the same scenario. They need to constantly force the victim into a never-ending series of responses. Okay, so that's what it's based on. That's what it's comprised of. Okay, and so once you understand that, you need to understand the hypergame theory and the Occam razor principle. There are other principles I just don't have time to go into. I'll touch on the two most important. Hypergame theory is basically game theory applied to decision tree modeling. Those are two mathematical models: game theory and decision tree modeling applied together. Okay. It's called the hypergame theory. It's called the non-cooperative gaming theorem. And basically what John Nash did, Professor John Nash, what he was able to do, is able to, using this new mathematical model, the non-cooperative gaming theorem, he was able to mathematically prove that by constantly and perpetually altering any value in the model, one can constantly and perpetually alter that model's expected outcome. So by CIA and DIA hiding behind it, using law enforcement and other organizations and agencies at the local, state, and federal level to do their dirty work, use this theorem, the non-cooperative gaming theorem, okay, the hypergame theory, on their victims to force the victim to constantly respond. If the victim doesn't respond, their technology fails. Okay, so by using the hypergame theory on the victim becomes the model. Okay, and so by constantly altering and perpetually altering any value in the daily life, daily activities, health and well-being, finances, communications, etc. of the victim, they can constantly and perpetually alter the daily life, daily activities, health and well-being, finances, communications, etc. of the victim, forcing the victim into a never-ending series of countermoves trying to function and survive each day. Because each countermove is an evoked potential, a synaptic response in the victim's brain, which can be remotely measured and integrated back into R&M data. Okay, so that's what organized stalking is used with regard to mind control. I just told you there are other reasons. Okay, surveillance, verification, etc. Keep the victim from defeating the technology and so forth. It's controlled by the local police. They're using third-party community-based agents called swarmers, okay? These swarmers will always be people who have some degree of expertise in the area of surveillance. So you're talking about prior military, retired police, etc., okay? Private investigators, for example, are often swarmers. They're responsible for each area, each neighborhood in which they live, work, and play, allowing for greater degrees of indirection and plausible deniability because everything's highly compartmentalized. People are only told what they need to know. So once you understand the hyper-game theory is being used against you each day, then the only way to defeat it is to refuse to play the game. You must understand, which they're not going to allow you to do. I mean, they'll force you to respond. If they have to physically do it, like today, they're going to do it. Okay, touching a person, the slightest touch in anger. I went to law school for 3 years at the University of Liverpool. I can tell you that the police tried to come up and start quoting law to me today. I said, no, you don't do that to me. I went to law school. You didn't. Okay, I understand the law. And the law, is simple. They understand it too. They just want to play the game. Okay, they don't want to be part of it. They don't want to deal with you, or they're utilized and as part of the game against you, whether they know it or not. Okay, so the slightest touch in anger is battery, and then to place a person in the immediate fear, to get in a person's face like the guy did today, aggressively and threatening them, etc. That's placing a person in the immediate fear of their physical safety. That's assault. So assault and battery occurred today, but it's been far worse. They put me in the hospital many times. They damaged my spine, beat me up, attacked me with deadly weapons. It just goes on and on and on. Okay, they must discredit their victims, and organized stalking is used to do that. Okay, they rely on what's called the Occam-Razor principle, the Occam-Razor theorem, and basically, again, I'm simplifying it, like I did the non-cooperative gaming theorem, but basically the Occam-Razor principle, the Occam-Razor theorem is this. People tend to generalize and use binary thinking to attach a single sample point to an entire group of people. So they can discredit an entire group of people using one or two people in these scripted, tailored mind games they're using against the victim to discredit the victim himself or herself, whoever's targeted, okay? So the Occam-Razor principle basically states that the simplest answer is always the truth. The simplest, because people generalize and use binary thinking, okay? The simplest answer is always the truth. The simplest explanation is always the best explanation, okay? And so, because the more complicated the truth, the less the likelihood of belief by the ordinary person, okay? It's easy for most people to turn away in disbelief. What do I mean? If the simplest answer is always the truth, if the simplest explanation is always the best explanation, okay, then by way of a generalization and binary thinking, the ordinary person, a person can be discredited. Anyone can be discredited simply by engaging in a sufficiently complex scheme of harassment. And because the more complicated the truth, the less the likelihood of belief by the ordinary person, the complexity of that scheme of harassment will generally be sufficient enough to cause most people to turn away in disbelief. It's called the Occam-Razor principle. They use the hyper-game theory and the Occam-Razor principle upon the victim. So they must discredit their victims. Absolutely. And they have no choice. If they don't discredit their victims, they got big trouble. Okay? They either have to, they have four objectives. Once the victim becomes credible, they have to do something with the victim. They have to kill the victim. If killing the victim is not the preferable option, then they must set up and entrap the victim and frame the victim, have them thrown in prison or a mental institution, or the fourth option being to mind hobble the victim. Okay? So those are the four options basically they're dealing with when a victim becomes credible. Okay? Because most target individuals mind control victims don't understand the technology that's being utilized against them, it's easy to discredit them. So again, he threw that's the non-cooperative gaming theorem. He threw his stuff in front of me, and with my stuff for the cashier wall bag, forcing me to push this stuff out of the way or pay for his stuff. Non-cooperative gaming theorem. I was forced to play the game in order to function. In order to function and survive, the victim must be forced to play the game. Otherwise, he must just lay down and die. He must perish. Okay? I'll give you an example. One night I was sleeping under a bridge. The whole fence line was open. There were gaps everywhere. Okay? But, they destroyed me financially. At that time, I had no income, and I was homeless sleeping on the street. Well, it was 25-degree weather, and I was sleeping in my sleeping bag under a bridge. Well, woke up the next morning, okay, and the entire area had been fenced off within just a few hours. And I woke up very early, so it had to have been done extremely early in the morning, like you're talking while it was still dark, okay, in 25-degree weather. At which point, I had to either climb that fence, play the game, forced to play the game, or perish, lay down and freeze to death, okay? That's called the non-cooperative gaming theorem, force the victim to respond. That's how the game works. So basically, what they're doing is the Department of Defense provides all the money through their Black Ops budgets. Okay, the National Security Agency provides the top scientists, or I should say the top scientists. Okay, it's the CIA and the DIA, the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, which provides the handlers and the operators. These are called hive mind teams. They're cognitive researchers. Most mind control victims have no hive mind team dedicated to them because they're easy targets. Those like myself have hive mind teams dedicated to them every 8 hours, surveillance teams, organized stalkers, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's how the game works. So they're using a fabricated and falsified stream of energy to interfere with the victim's memory and thought process. They want the victim to become dependent upon the system, meaning they want the victim to believe that their impulse injections are their own. They want you to believe that the impulses you're receiving, the responses you're receiving, are your own. Okay, that's called. Well, I just explained what that is. Okay, I just explained the mathematical models they're using against the victim. Okay, so once you become dependent upon the system's output, okay, or they believe your responses to it are consistent, at that point they'll begin to fabricate these subconscious responses. This is a supercomputer now. Okay, hive mind teams involved. They can manually inject, and they do EEG, heterodyning, etc. Okay. But most of the assassination and torture, the remote neural monitoring, remote neural manipulation is done by a computer. It's a supercomputer, okay? A computer multiplexer routes the signal to a tower, satellite, or mobile platform, and the tower, satellite, or mobile platform relays the signal to the digital receiver, similar to how cell phone technology works. So the digital receiver is tracked and pinpointed in real time, just like a cell phone, except with CIA and DIA mind control technologies. The digital receiver is not a phone, it's a human brain. The brain of the victim has been digitalized by the nanotechnology inside of it. It's basically the nanotech's an amplifier. Okay, the nanotechnology adheres to the neurotransmitters of the victim's brain and begins to speak to and decode those neurotransmitters. Okay, so if the victim is unaware, and most are, they have no idea, okay, that they're targeted in this way, they'll begin to fabricate these. They want you to become dependent upon the system, and at that point, if they see that you are dependent upon the system, you don't understand what's happening, or they recognize at least your responses are consistent, at that point is when they'll begin to fabricate these subconscious responses, such as dishonesty, positive recognition, anxiety, etc. Okay, those are called thought-triggered attacks, remote neural attacks. Okay, to convince you that the fabricated responses are your own. Remember, this is a fabricated and falsified stream of energy. It contains data. Okay, what I mean by data: the previous choice memory references of the victim. Okay, etc. Falsified and fabricated. So if the victim is unaware of this constant mental manipulation, the system, the R&M supercomputer, the victim's brain is remotely tied to by way of this bidirectional stream of energy, okay, at that point, if the victim is unaware that it's happening, then the system will begin to shape the thoughts and behavior of the victim. By manipulation of the daily motives and emotional perceptions of the victim, the system will begin to shape the thoughts and behavior of the victim. That's called direct behavioral control, okay? So they use that then to attempt to restrict the victim from to restrict the victim's thoughts or behavior by blocking and interfering with the victim's real memories and injecting this fabricated and falsified memories, the fabricated and falsified stream. So blocking real memories, injecting with fabricated and falsified memories. That's memory management. Okay, that's the second category of mind control. Censorship, memory management, direct behavioral control. It's everything they're doing to their victims, including me. Okay, so blocking real memories, injecting with fabricated and falsified memories. EDM, electronic dissolution of memory. There are many different ways that they can block, okay, and inject, blocking and injection methods. Okay, so the point is to understand that this interference is triggered at will by the system or the attackers, the hive mind teams, and the game is endless based on the mathematical model known as the hypergame theory. Okay, so if you don't understand, if you don't have a basic understanding of the technology, then they got you. Okay, if you can't learn to read active memory, you're a sitting duck for this technology. And reading active memory basically means to contrast your own normal memory and thought process from the remote neural attacks, the fabricated and falsified memories they're constantly injecting into your subconscious by looking for patterns. Everything they're doing is based on patterns. From mind control, which is decoding thought patterns, all the way to organized stalking, which is based on choice reference patterns. The system is designed, it's pattern recognition, okay? The system is designed to establish patterns of behavior, patterns of responses, to determine I'm being attacked right now. The pain just increased, okay? That's censorship, okay? So see, they just blanked my mind. I just mentioned this electronic dissolution of memory. They just blanked my mind, okay? So what I'm trying to say is, so basically, I just got my mind blank. Electronic dissolution of memory. They use the pain stimulus to do it. Okay, so at that point, the system begins to fabricate these responses, and if the victim is not aware that he's not able to read active memory, he's a sitting duck. Okay? And reading active memory means to fabricate and falsify. Reading active memory means to understand the fabricated and falsified attacks are happening, the remote neural attacks, okay, are looking for patterns. Again, everything they're doing is based on patterns. If from mind control to coding thought patterns to organized stalking, choice reference patterns, it's all pattern recognition. They need to establish patterns. One response is not enough. They need a pattern of those responses. Okay, at that point, once they have enough of these responses, okay, the RNN system is designed to constantly provoke you, not just the organized stalking, but the actual attacks, the remote neural attacks, are actually designed to constantly provoke you into emotional responses so that they can generate what are called response statistics. That the system relies on that statistical data, response statistics, that the system then uses to determine how to interpret and link descriptions with data captured about your memory references, okay? Previous choice references, memories, okay? So they're constantly going to try, the organized stalkers are constantly going to get in your face and keep you talking or trying to solicit a response like happened to me today. Organized stalkers, mostly they're just thugs. Eventually some probably realize what's happening, what's going on, but most, the organized stalkers, they don't know what's happening. Everything's highly compartmentalized, okay? That's how they're able to use friends and family against the victim. Informants, they don't tell them the truth. They tell them this person's a bad person. Slander in the community is a big part of it. Okay, to get them to do the bidding, they must force the victim to respond, and to responses, control responses, which can be remotely verified. Okay, it's not enough the victim respond. If the victim goes around responding all the time in chaotic and random situations and conversations, it screws up their technology. All right, so again. They need to generate enough of these responses, which they can then correlate into response statistics. Once they correlate this data into response statistics, they use that statistical data to determine how to interpret and link descriptions with data captured about your memory references. Okay, try to ignore any type of prolonged encounter. Okay, with people you don't know. They need to keep you talking. That's why cyber stalking happens so often. They're constantly targeting me on social media and on internet forums. It's just the victim must play the game. They can establish a cognitive model. The system can establish a cognitive model through trauma, using physical and psychological trauma to map out and reverse engineer the sensory and neural pathways of the victim's brain and central nervous system. The system can build a cognitive model of the victim's brain and central nervous system within 6 to 12 months. But reverse engineering the memory, the will, intellect, and emotion of the victim, okay, the human soul, okay, the will, intellect, and emotion of the victim, that's a lengthy process. It takes a long time, okay? That's why a lot of victims are targeted for years. So they're trying to provoke the victim and to constantly respond to them, okay, verifiably, into controlled situations and conversations. Once they have enough of those response statistics, that statistical data, the system uses your own previous memories against you, your own previous choice references, and then injects them back into your subconscious, okay, at regular intervals. That's where you look for patterns. That's how you read active memory. And during normal memory and thought process, it injects those previous choice references, your own memories, back into your subconscious at regular intervals. Impulse injections. It doesn't just download the memory, okay, of the event. It also downloads the associated impulse at speed of light. Those impulse injections are then injected back into the subconscious of the victim, impulse sequencing, okay, during normal thought activity, okay, to convince the victim that the response was their own, to influence the victim to engage in some type of verbalization or related action. That's verification, okay? Some type of verbalization or related action. They need you to speak. They need you to act. They need you to do something to verify their technology is working properly. Without verification, there can be no mind control. Okay? Without integration completion, if integration completion is hindered in any way between the victim's brain and the supercomputer, that neural link, that information and injection feedback loop, okay, then at that point, they've got to start all over with a new verification routine. The verification process will break apart and mind control will fail. Verification is crucial to their technology. So you learn how to defeat their technology by learning how to read active memory. Once they see what you respond to, that's when they begin to fabricate these situational and conversational scenarios based on events or topics they know are going to capture your attention. Like today, I had no choice. They captured my attention as soon as he threw his stuff, and he got up in my face and yelling at me and screaming. I recorded it, But it doesn't do any good to try to post that recording on YouTube, because it just becomes the pattern for the next wave of torture and harassment. Okay, and they just use it to discredit the victim. The Occam razor principle. They discredit the victim with the. They want the victim to post these these recordings to take pictures. They want the victim to do it over and over again. Each time the victim is responding, he's doing exactly what they need him to do. Okay? The point is, they're going to use whatever you respond to against you. Your favorite sports team, if you're religious, they'll use God. They'll use whatever they can to force you to respond. If they can't do it situationally or conversationally, they're going to do it physically, okay, like happened today. And of course, San Diego police are behind it. Again, it's controlled at the local level by every local police department in America, using what are called these third-party community-based agents. A lot of them are just retired cops, okay, and they're the ones that organize and orchestrate the swarming, the organized stalking. So they're going to, get in your face and provoke you like the guy did to me today, into an emotional response to map out your memory and thought process in order to subsequently inject those injected impulses, not just the memory of the event, but the associated impulse itself, and control you, manipulate your daily motives and your emotional perceptions. But it must be aggressive at regular intervals. If the victim is not sensitized to the organized stalking, it doesn't work, okay? So, they'll use, a handsome guy if you're a girl. They'll use a hot chick if you're a guy. They're constantly running these women past me. I've caught on to their tactics. They need to map out all 7 vectors of the emotional state of the victim. And, the victim's attraction to the opposite sex is a big part of that. If they can't complete the cognitive model, their technology doesn't work properly. Okay? So these constant remote neural attacks are how the technology works. And they can do, again, censorship, memory management, and direct behavioral control. Okay, censorship, memory management, direct behavioral control. They don't care about the law. They don't care about your lawsuits. They don't care about you calling 911 like I did today. I'm a law student. I went to law school. I know I need to tie those who are guilty to that incident. So I call 911. I call the police. Okay, I'm tying them to that incident. But I'm actually doing more than that. I'm actually forwarding copies of each 911 call to my attorney in Ecuador to try to let them know what's happening. But again, it's all about manipulation of the daily motives and emotional perceptions of the victim. They'll use it. They don't care about the law. They don't care about they don't fear God or man. They'll use. They're not worried about any legal constraints or any particularly acceptable way of life. They're simply going to use anything you enjoy, hate, or appreciate against you, no matter what it is, to abuse you, regardless of your behavior. So if they walk up in the morning and give you a compliment on your shoes, they're simply establishing a memory anchor, trying to tie you, to sensitize you to that memory, to that situational and conversational scenario, so that they can do it. So that by sensitizing the victim, to tying the victim to that to that memory anchor, they want to see how you will respond when they turn around and they negate it nightly with the remote neural attacks, with forcing the victim into an incoherent pattern of abusive, incoherent pattern of thought. The system is designed to remotely capture random bits of the victim's memory and thought process. I'll explain that in just a second. If you keep a handle on your state of your activity and your situational and conversational perception, then you may begin your emotional state. You may begin to realize that these conflicted impulses are happening, looking for patterns, pattern recognition. Okay, but the problem is it is possible for the system to overpower your impulses. Okay, once they've mapped out the different emotions, those different motivations, the motivational impulses, they can overpower those impulses, cause you to burn with rage with each organized stalking attack. The organized stalking is timed. People don't realize this. The organized stalking is timed in sequence with remote neural attacks, okay, to amplify the trauma of the event, okay? So that's called verification, okay? They need you to respond. So they target the victim with electromagnetic low frequency waves to cause the victim to become enraged, to lash out at their stalkers. That's how they set up and entrap the victim. Okay, that's called verification, to engage in some type of related action or verbalization, okay, to that specific organized stalking event. Okay, so those powerful impulses, if you can recognize them, it should prompt you to reevaluate your current state of mind, and you can recognize the attacks are happening, but the system can't overpower your impulses. That's the reason they tortured the victim to near incoherency with sleep deprivation torture, directed energy torture, etc. So the victim can't recognize modification of their active memory in real time to fight back against the system's influences. For me, they want the victim to engage in a pattern. Okay, they want you to zone. They want you to zone on your activities, to engage in the same pattern every day, because then the organized stalking, it works better. The system works better once the victim begins to zone on their activities. So not zone. Okay, what I need people to understand is how, remote neural manipulation works. Basically, the remote neural manipulation operates off remote neural monitoring. It's basically entirely dependent upon, the R&M system is entirely dependent upon its ability to predict and influence the reference choices of the victim during thought composition. Okay? Predict and influence reference choices, thought composition. Okay, what are reference choices? Memories. What's thought composition? As you're formulating your thoughts and you're preparing to act. Okay, these are thought triggered attacks. Energy travels at the speed of light. Remote neural monitoring system locks onto your emotional state and begins to attack you based upon whatever it can capture. Any brainwave pattern can be captured, held, and replayed perpetually in the victim's mind over and over again. And that, that's a form of torture. Repetition is torture. Think of the Chinese water torture. Okay, repetition is torture. Okay, so they want to be able to predict and influence the reference choices of the victim during impulse sequencing, or using impulse sequencing, or predicting and influence the reference choices or impulse sequencing of the victim during thought composition. As you're formulating your thoughts and you're preparing to act, the R&M supercomputer is actually mapping those patterns of your responses, patterns of your of impulses and identifiers. Okay, and then it uses that statistical data. What's statistical data? Response statistics. Okay, it uses that statistical data about your composition habits. Okay, in order to define and map those references, in order to predict how you're going to think or act as you formulate your thoughts and you prepare to act. The system's ability to define and map those references. Remember, they map it using reverse engineer your will, intellect, and emotion, using trauma, physical and psychological trauma. But the system has to be able to define and map those references. Okay? And if it can't do that intelligibly, and it depends either on the cooperation of the victim, meaning the victim is ignorant of the fact they're even targeted, okay, with the technology, or at least on the attackers, the R&M supercomputer, the hive mind teams, etc. At least on the attackers' ability to make their ability to make sense of what they see visually on their virtual interface. They're using a virtual interface against you, okay, not a computer screen, okay, or what they can guess based on your past activity. If they cannot make sense of what they see on their virtual interface, they have no choice but to revert back to the past activity of the victim, okay, in order to predict and influence, reference choices, thought composition, okay? They're using a virtual interface, okay, which only they can see. Think of a virtual headset, which produces a virtual environment, but they don't need the headset because they have the mobile platform, they have the neurochip. It's called the electronic brain-to-brain interface, and they're able to use to create a virtual interface. I don't have time to go into that, okay? I've talked about it before. You can Google it, and Google it with my name, and you'll see how it works, okay? But, they're constantly going to run you through a verification routine each day. That's what the organized stalking is about. Where the R&M supercomputer is actually probing you for a set of responses, specific responses, okay? It's not enough that you respond to just any chaotic and random event, okay? You must respond to their specific stimuli, okay? In order to establish a pattern of responses. One response is not enough. They need multiple responses to determine single coherent patterns of thought. That's how the system works. Okay, and if the victim realizes they're being targeted and has a basic understanding of the technology and is able to counter that, quenching, multitasking, listening to pleasing music, somehow to mentally shield, to disrupt the return training signal, then the attackers, the system itself, and the hive mind teams will attempt to verify by different means. Okay, the system's constantly probing you for a response. If you ignore it, it's not just going to sit there. The supercomputer is going to inject again and again, each time at a higher level. What do I mean by higher level? I'm trying to get all this done in a 30-minute time, but it's absolutely impossible. The technology is too sophisticated and advanced. So, anyway, it's almost 40 minutes into this. I'm going to have to wrap this up.